Well, hello, folks. DHRM, just to introduce our topic a little bit here today, first responders speaking out on racial bias in the workplace. DHRM is working with the Division of Multicultural Affairs to present more extensive learning opportunities on the subjects of diversity, equity, and inclusion. These opportunities should afford managers and employees a greater understanding and depth of knowledge into these issues in our workplace. So while we recognize that awareness is foundational today, we're going to be skimming the surface to address the following practical objectives. There are 4 of them that you see there. Identifying common feelings and responses when we talk about race or racism, recognizing common statements that harm inclusiveness, examining conversation tools, including preparing for conversations, gauging your audience, and having the conversation itself. And finally, recognizing some leadership obligations that you have. So I hope you'll find some useful information today. And many of these ideas can also be applied when we're looking at other harmful biases as well, such as gender and age bias. So the question might be asked, why this and why now? If you've paid the least bit of attention to our challenges as a state and nation, you're certainly aware that race and racism is a major feature in the dialogue. And together we bear the responsibility to advance the principles of democracy, and many of our local leaders are speaking out on this. Specifically, Governor Cox has stated that inclusion and equality aren't just woke concepts or progressive fads. They're core to our humanity. Implicit bias is real and takes work to overcome. The way we treat people, especially those that are different than us, is a window into our soul. You may also be aware that Governor Cox has the One Utah Roadmap, and it has some principles that specifically address issues of inclusion and diversity. There's also the Utah Compact on Racial Equity, Diversity, and Inclusion. It's been signed. It's a declaration that's been signed by civic and community leaders, including our governor, lieutenant governor, and many department heads. The first statement of the compact is, we acknowledge that racism exists and our actions make a difference. We call out racism wherever we see it and take purposeful steps to stop it. So to start with some context of our climate, I'd like to glance at a few findings from the Pew Research Center's report entitled Race in America. You see from these results here that a majority of Americans indicate that their feeling is that race relations in the United States are generally bad. On top of that, a majority indicate that they're getting worse. And this research that started in 2016 indicates even more troubling that it's now more common than ever for people to express racist or racially insensitive views. And that's why we're kind of where we're at today in this topic. Now, these statistics paint a picture, but many people I interact with express that they don't feel confident in confronting racially insensitive behaviors. I put out a little poll. We had a little bit of participation as we just before we started today's session, and the indication is that most of you who have chosen to join us today are somewhere in between. The majority are somewhere between somewhat disagreeing and somewhat agreeing that they feel prepared to confront workplace racial bias. So this is especially troubling in the workplace because the politics and power dynamics are higher stakes than, say, a neighborhood barbecue or a family gathering with your crazy uncle. So moreover, due to the legal safeguards and defined policies that we have in workplaces, racial bias often slinks in the shadows, and it can be veiled by slights and aggressions cloaked in a euphemism and disparate treatment, frankly. So we'll attempt to shine some light on this today and suggest some tools to confront racism and racial bias. So you may feel it's none of my business or beyond my expertise. And might be especially true if you're among the 78% of Utahns that look like me, a white demographic majority. A common misconception that many white people have is that we should expect people of color to explain and confront racism for us. While it's important to center the voices of underrepresented people, it's also important to lessen the burden of expecting people of color to champion any concern, which can be emotionally taxing. So that's one reason why you're hearing from a white man in this webinar. There are many resources available, and building racial literacy is an important step in creating a more just world. Terms change quickly and as we come to new understandings. So I want you to understand how I'm using these terms today. When I refer to race, I'm referring to a social construct devised to group people based on shared physical or social characteristics. So all of us have been cultured to make judgments based on these categories. And when our brains make judgments without our specific attention, we call these inclinations implicit or unconscious bias. We've also developed some conscious biases as well based on experiences and beliefs. So we'll be looking into how these biases manifest themselves with regard to race in comments and behaviors. While all humans share more in common than not, our American social systems have excluded, obstructed, and even exploited people who do not look like white Europeans. And for this webinar, I'll use the term people of color to collectively denote the 22% of Utahns and 40% of Americans who do not look like or identify as descendants of white Europeans. So some of our social systems in Utah and America have sought to expand diversity, which I'm defining as building a population where more racial groups are present or represented, and inclusion being different, where people of all racial groups have an influence on the decisions and practices. So if we want to speak out on racial bias to create an inclusive workplace, we must start with a willingness to examine our own feelings and responses. So when we talk about racism, most of us don't think of ourselves as holding or acting on racial biases. We have a much easier time identifying others as biased, and so it's not so easy to see ourselves as causing harm. Stephen M.R. Covey observed that we judge ourselves by our intentions and others by their behaviors. Consequently, there are a host of feelings that emerge when we find ourselves in the position of an offender. Racially insensitive statements and behaviors are particularly subversive because they don't strike at ideas or beliefs as much as they strike at a person's worth as a human being. And this is the impact, regardless of what the intention may have been. Corporate strategist and educator Dr. David Jackson suggests a mindset shift when we explore racial bias. So it requires that we shift from being the knower to being a learner and entertaining curiosity, letting go of the need to justify our actions in this regard. We can assume an attitude of greater empathy and approachability. So essentially, Dr. Jackson is advising us to exercise some humility by recognizing that our subjective experience is neither complete nor objective. We don't have to swim in shame. Rather, we can be open to adopting behaviors and practices that enrich ourselves, our organizations, and cease to cause pain to others. You may have heard Socrates' assertion that the unexamined life is not worth living. I love, there's a popular speaker named Helen Turnbull. I love how she pivots on this and indicates or suggests that the unexamined brain is not worth trusting. So imagine when confronted on a bias, if we shifted from retrenching in embarrassment and shame and instead had a response of something like, thank you for giving me an opportunity to reflect, or something of that sort. We also would do well to remember that when a person confronts us, they may have endured considerable frustration and pain before mustering the courage to do that. So sometimes it comes from a place of hurt and anger, and consequently, a valid observation might be presented to us in a way that we find unpleasant or disagreeable. Though we might wish that being confronted was a little more pleasant, we can curb our urge to defend our egos and instead listen and explore. Adrian Parker is a corporate leader and influencer, and he identified 5 common responses he encounters when race is discussed. These responses, I should say, do not define a person, nor do they represent a person's response in every situation. So I have 2 reasons really for sharing these. The first is to recognize when we have used an ineffective or hurtful response so we can challenge our faulty assumptions in action. And the second is so that we can recognize the assumptions and defensive responses in those we confront so we can tailor our approach more effectively. And as the author notes, these are really oversimplified, and the purpose is to get a rough idea of how to proceed when you confront a person on a racially biased comment or behavior. So let's begin the bottom left-hand corner with the rejector. So when confronted, a person responding this way might perceive it as a threat or an attack. A rejector response does not acknowledge that racism exists, or at least that it happens as often as claimed. These responses might cast racism as a past tense phenomenon or something that happens in isolated incidents. So also a person responding this way may have difficulty recognizing the behavior in action. At an extreme, a rejector response could escalate into personal attacks in an attempt to discredit the offended party. So these responses, the rejector responses, are defensive attempts to control the dialogue. So how would I proceed if faced with a rejector response? Well, a person who exhibits this response isn't prepared to exhibit empathy or meaningful resolution. So it's usually best to issue a simple and direct appeal for decency without a lengthy discussion. So let's move up to the resistor here. Principally, this response criticizes the confrontation itself. So the resistor responses seek to convince others that they were misunderstood or that their comment was taken out of context, or project that the offended party is actually the real problem. The resistor responses refuse to acknowledge that a comment or behavior is inappropriate, and harmful statements might be dismissed with various rationalizations or excuses. The question is, how would I approach this kind of response? So it might be best to give a person a little time once you've initially confronted them. People responding this way often have enough emotional intelligence to recognize the harm that may have been done once the heat of the situation passes. Then they may be open to a discussion or a restorative process. They could be open to learning. You're going to have to gauge that by paying close attention to their verbal and nonverbal cues. Dropping back down to the lower right-hand corner with the referee, this type of response arises from the discomfort of a conflict situation. Referee response is usually quick to agree with both the offender and the offended parties, and it tends toward keeping score on valid claims and while disqualifying others. So there's usually an attempt to justify and validate both parties. And there may be attempts to minimize the offense, dismiss the hurt that it caused, and ignore the history or the context of the offensive behavior. So in approaching this type of response, people using a referee type of response are primarily interested in escaping the immediate discomfort of the situation. It might be helpful to acknowledge the discomfort and allow space for it. It may be wise to redirect the discussion away from who is right to what can be done about assuring an environment where everyone feels safe and included. And one note I have also for this is because referee responses seek to curtail the discussion, they imperil meaningful resolutions, and that can force behaviors and hostilities underground while allowing the hurt to fester. Let's go into the center with the realist. This response is a convenient middle seat. It appears impartial. It's silently positioned between supporting people of color and being indifferent. It acknowledges racism as wrong, but struggles to see it as deliberate or systemic. If a realist response suggests that racism is historical or accidental, they may also suggest that it's unlikely that any meaningful action or accountability can affect an outcome. So realist responders may contend that they didn't do racism and therefore they have no power or responsibility to fix it. Silence or disengagement is preferable. So how would you approach this? Well, people responding this way are likely to engage in a conversation, believe it or not. They're likely to listen, learn, and correct course to create a more inclusive space. Most people responding this way just lack the appreciation for the depth of impact that racial hostilities create. And they might also have difficulty recognizing their power to influence the situation. However, they have a strong potential of coming to an understanding of how a situation causes harm. And finally, in this graphic, the upper right-hand corner is an anti-racist response. So this acknowledges racial dynamics, majority culture advantages, and uses this understanding to influence people and systems. Those who exercise this type of response recognize they have a bias, they make missteps, and they will make more and are more willing to entertain ideas to promote inclusiveness. Anti-racist responders may be more apt to accept and to expect and accept being confronted without feeling personally threatened themselves. So in approaching this type of response, anti-racist responders they're typically responsive to being confronted. They recognize it's going to happen despite their good intentions and best efforts. Awareness and empathy, however, will lead them to be more likely to engage in a conversation, make course corrections, and arrive at inclusive resolutions. So now let's shift to talking about common statements that harm inclusiveness. If we're going to speak up, we have to recognize harmful statements when they occur. We could write this off pejoratively as, political correctness, or we could begin to see the harm these statements do and make changes. Most of us recognize overt racism. Unfortunately, racial bias is often revealed in subtle ways, and targeted racism is often veiled. So we're less likely to recognize these behaviors and confront them. So let's examine a few common statements that harm inclusiveness. This is just a start. And when you begin to recognize a few, you'll begin to notice other comments or behaviors that you may have heard or that you might hear or that you might make yourself. And then you can change these or remove them from your dialogue and make others aware as well. Remember that the impact of these comments may not match the speaker's intention, but we're focusing here on impact. First one, I don't see color. I treat everyone the same. To others, this can register as, I choose to ignore that color has and continues to play a significant role in your experience as a human being. Talking about race just makes things worse. By claiming that talking about it is the problem, people avoid addressing the behavior itself. Ignoring the topic increases the person or group's comfort with the behavior. And then on a larger scale, avoiding the topic altogether provides people and institutions with a convenient excuse to disregard policies and practices that create imbalances. Everybody's racist. Well, this can really feel like, since I acknowledge that everyone has racial bias, I see no significance or reason of how racism has disproportionately impacted communities of color. I can't be racist. Some of my best friends are, fill in the blank. This can feel like I claim an exemption from any accusation that my behaviors are evidence of racial bias. Knowing people of other races really doesn't keep you from engaging in discriminatory behavior or failing to challenge racist practices. You're a credit to your people, or you're so articulate. This feels like I expect people of your race to be unskilled with words, less educated, less intelligent, yada. These statements land as underhanded compliments that appear to make their subjects exceptions to what the speaker views as an inferior racial identity. Everyone has the same chance for success. It's what you do with it or how hard you work. This implies that people of color are lazy and need to work harder. It alludes to a myth of meritocracy that disregards the systemic barriers to achievement that are in place. Slavery and segregation was a long time ago. We should stop dwelling on it and move on. Or sometimes it's stated as, don't blame me, I never owned slaves. This feels like I only acknowledge suffering in the past. I'm not willing to acknowledge that racism impacts current social and political structures. So people aren't asking you to accept blame. We're asking you to see how all of us are connected in society. And one person's disadvantage is, on the other side, another person's unearned advantage. We can understand how the system is disadvantaged, and take some responsibility for working to make a more just society for all. You people. Well, this in its statement is it excludes or others people. Suggesting you people is suggesting that not we the people. It also implies that one person's or a group of people's actions represent an entire race. And finally, I'm not racist. Well, this claim seeks to invalidate any negative feedback, to eliminate a chance to reflect and correct a behavior or condition. It begs the question, why does the person feel such a need to clarify this? So hurtful statements can be accompanied by harmful subtext and observable behaviors. So sometimes it's not so much what is said, but how it is said. And it might be laced with sarcasm, air quotes, or other symbolic gestures like eye rolls. Perhaps a person speaking ignores the presence of a person of color or refuses the eye contact that they give to others. Here are a few common behaviors to recognize. The first one there is disparate treatment. This is issuing disproportionate expectations, whether those are lower or higher, without any legitimate justification. Judging a person's behavior as inappropriate when the same behavior might be acceptable for others. Displaying exaggerated flattery or changing pitch, volume, or tone when speaking to people of color. Assuming stereotypes, and this can come in the way of work ethics, slang terminology, food preferences, music preferences, capabilities and aptitudes, education level, religion, economic status, and it goes on. Suggestive depictions. You will probably notice, and perhaps you have, or will in the future here, that there tends to be an imbalance of bad and undesirable images and actions featuring people of color. A lot of organizations have tried to start to combat this. And at times, these images are contrasted by good or desirable images or actions featuring white people. Imitating and especially mocking through racial stereotypes. Expecting one person of color to represent an entire race and the experience of that group, or to ask that person to speak in behalf of a race. Sometimes a person might cite a person of color to suggest a universal representation. Insisting people of color not share their own racial perspectives and experiences. This can feel like if your experiences are different from the dominant culture, they're not appropriate, or they're provocative or contentious. Use of euphemisms or euphemistic substitutions or coded language to tear down another race. This attempts to disguise racial stereotyping with seemingly palatable terms, like using hoodlums, thugs, or radicals to describe a gathering of young professionals who are people of color. More subtly, describing them as threatening or dangerous suggests sinister motives and evokes thoughts of fear. And finally, insisting a person is too sensitive. You may not be aware of the experience of that person, nor the historical or social context in which that comment or behavior lands. So there's a mound of evidence that these behaviors and some of the comments that we talked about earlier harm individuals, and not just individuals, but the organizations that they work for. Everyone is harmed. Racial bias is so ubiquitous that people are often unaware that they have engaged in demeaning or offensive comments. So we may have to make that visible to them. And we have to be willing to allow others to make us aware, even as we challenge our own implicit behaviors. So let's break apart the conversation that you will have. We know that moments like this are going to happen, so we need to prepare ourselves for it. Whether your conversation is with a colleague or a customer or someone else, think of yourself as the one who will speak up. Many don't. Confronting a person doesn't have to be abrupt or rife with hostility. Many times a simple question or retort or a brief comment will suffice. Many times behaviors or comments catch us by surprise, perhaps shockingly. So consider what you will say in advance of a situation. Often when we're in a state of shock over what someone said, not only are we not prepared with any words, we're not even, or with the right words, we're not prepared with any words. And when the moment happens, if you've thought of a handful of responses, you increase your chances of effectively handling the situation. This graphic is from the work of Dr. David Campt. It captures some brief responses that people use when longer conversations aren't possible, or if a longer conversation must be delayed. Looking at the slide, I need to explain it, that the least confrontational retorts are at the bottom, and they escalate in intensity as we go up, sort of like a thermometer, if you will. So I don't suggest the top three. We're going to not talk about those. The top two are typically reserved for formal complaints and management action. And we'll discuss that just slightly a little bit later. But let's look at the examples, or let's look at some examples of each of these others that are there. So we start at the bottom, clarifying what was heard. This might come out as a comment such as, "Excuse me, I didn't hear you. Oh, what was that?" Second one up, feigned ignorance. This might be a comment such as, "I don't understand what you mean by that," or "Can you explain?" And this is especially good for inappropriate humor, since explaining it deflates the humor. The next one is a feigned doubt of sincerity, and that might come out such as, "Did you just say," or "You don't mean that, do you?" The next one would be a challenge to the veracity of the comment. "Surely you don't think," or "Are you saying that such and such?" Next one up would be appeal to the hypothetical, and that would be, "Would you say that if so-and-so was here?" Then raising perception issues is the third from the top there. And that would be, you might want to reconsider whether you want to say something like that in this setting. It's a simple statement, not asking a question, but it calls on a person to really think about what they just said. Expressing your boundaries. This would look something of the sort of, "I don't want to hear those type of comments." And then linking to your feelings. saying something that I find that statement incredibly offensive or hurtful. It lets the person know that something hasn't landed well and is not acceptable. Now, when you engage in more than, or when you can engage in more than a one-line retort, you've been afforded an opportunity. And we're going to break this into 3 parts: preparing for conversations, gauging your audience, and having the conversation. Like I said, this is for a longer discussion or a longer opportunity to explore the frustration and the feelings that were exhibited by a comment or a behavior. Let's first look at preparing for the conversation. First thing is to establish goals for a conversation. It's helpful to be clear about what you want to leave the conversation with. While you might wish to change another person's mind, that's probably not realistic. A more practical objective might be gaining commitment that the behavior will not be repeated, and gaining some, or perhaps gaining some level of acknowledgement from your conversation partner that they recognize the harmfulness of the behavior, or seeking some level of restitution. Managing your expectations is going to help you avoid anger and frustration. And while mind shifts might be unlikely, recognize that even if they do occur, they may take time and require far more than one conversation. So especially if you're going to be interacting with this person in the future, do your best to leave the door open for future dialogue. Consider the set and setting. If you're a supervisor, it's tempting to gather staff and issue unilateral statements. This, however, isn't likely to be the most effective strategy for an incident involving a smaller group or a pair of individuals. While expectations should be communicated clearly to all the staff, and the incident might be indicative of a general lack of understanding, addressing a particular incident should be limited to the parties directly involved. And in most cases, the offender is one individual. So arrange a time with an adequate duration and a private, comfortable, and safe location for your conversation. And try to have the conversation face-to-face if you can. We're in a distance mode now, and that could still be done virtually with the camera on. If the matter was particularly egregious, it might be necessary to involve a third party. Please consult your HR office if this is the case. Assume good intentions, but set limits. Plan to ask questions to understand, as well as sharing your feelings and concerns. And if you don't understand where your conversation partner is coming from, clarify rather than accuse or assume what they are saying. If you enter the conversation assuming good intentions, you will seek to build understanding rather than to win an argument. That said, be prepared for the possibility that you may need to end a conversation before arriving at a resolution. And in no way, you should set limits, so in no way that you need to tolerate personal attacks or pervasive hostility. You must either remove yourself from the situation and or call upon an appropriate authority to intervene. By shutting off bad behavior, you're limiting its contagion. Fewer people hear it or experience it. So here's a question. What if the moment passed? This has happened to me. Sometimes when an offensive comment or behavior occurs, it gnaws at us for some time afterward. Perhaps we didn't recognize it initially, or we dismissed it as insignificant, or we didn't have the time or energy to deal with it in the moment. So we might not recognize the impact right away, or if it was so shocking that we need time to process our thoughts and feelings, when a little time passes, it might actually be a better opportunity to confront the behavior. And it's most effective to immediately interrupt the behavior and stop it and describe why it was offensive, express disappointment, and reestablish expectations. But if the initial opportunity passes, you can still revisit the incident with the person who triggered the offense. It's always better to say something than to ignore it, because silence is interpreted as collusion and sends a ripple that might spread beyond the group who witnessed the behavior. It just destroys trust. Let's move to gauging your audience. Your approach to a conversation is going to obviously depend on the person who exhibited the offensive behavior or comment and the context in which it happened. And I'm using this a very wide swath when it might be unfair just to say, call a person, oh, the offender. But for lack of a better word, this is what I'm calling it. This behavior was hurtful. And so you need to take a look at your audience. Is this a person that you share a relationship of trust with? If so, this is a person that's more likely to respond favorably to you. In your experience, is this a person who's open-minded or a critical thinker? This would also be a person who typically demonstrates a thirst for learning, curiosity, and ability to see things from various perspectives, and has a general respect of other people's beliefs and experiences. This is also a person that's more likely to respond favorably to you if your approach feels safe to them. What if a person's level, or what is the person's level of empathy in other situations? So this might be demonstrated by how they react to other people's emotions, how they treat others, coworkers, and whether they advocate for others. This is a type of person that may react favorably to an appeal to the empathy which they possess. Is this a person with particular authority? An open confrontational approach might be perceived as a challenge to the person's authority. So it's likely best to arrange a private meeting with an individual an individual possessing formal authority so that you can express your concerns in private with them. Did the incident occur in a one-on-one conversation? In this case, you might be able to resolve the issue informally without a private meeting or a prepared conversation. However, if the incident occurred in a group setting, it might be appropriate to express disagreement and discomfort immediately with the incident, even though it might not be possible to stop the business of the entire group. A follow-up to address the matter might be necessary. And however, if the incident was in broad display in the group, it might be appropriate to assert your discomfort with the behavior. It may be appropriate to address it with the group facilitator at the earliest convenience, and make a request to revisit the matter as a group so that you can reestablish as a group or a team some level of trust and expectations about behaviors moving forward. What if you observed the incident, but you were not the target of the offense? Now, this is important because if you recognize an offense, you were affected. You can speak to the incident from how you experienced it. You should avoid putting the person who was targeted on the spot to pass a judgment on whether the incident was acceptable. Speak for yourself, and if it was unacceptable to you, it's likely offensive to others, whether or not they speak up. I might add that if someone directs the question or judgment to the person or race that was targeted, it's inappropriate. Redirect the matter back to your observation. You don't have to be thorny about it. You can simply say that it made you feel uncomfortable or didn't feel inclusive. In most cases, your group will be careful about that in the future. Finally, it's time to talk and have the conversation. So let's start with some do's and don'ts. Do start from a place of curiosity and care. Try framing your questions with sentences like, what do you mean by that? Or how might we, or I'd be curious to know. Do identify the behavior and its impact. Describe the behavior rather than labeling the person. Sometimes pointing out the behavior candidly helps someone hear what they're really saying or doing. Lead with I statements. Sharing your perception personalizes the exchange rather than relying on logical explanation that your partner may not agree with or track with. Logical explanations also take a lot of effort that require time, background, context, and education. Do ask open-ended questions to understand where your conversation partner is coming from. Try something like, how did you arrive at that? Or what does that mean to you? Do stay on topic. Your conversation partner may try to deflect your questions by switching the focus of the conversation. After all, this subject can be very uncomfortable. Deflections take focus away from the exhibited behavior or the comment. If necessary, redirect the conversation to the observed behavior and its impact, and stay away from intentions. Do appeal to principles. If the speaker is someone you have a relationship with, appeal to their better instincts and principles. An example might be, Bob, I've always thought of you as a fair-minded person, so it shocks me when I hear you say something so hurtful. Do consider taking a pause and returning to the conversation at a different time if you feel like the conversation is moving toward conflict and away from a true conversation. There's a difference between a conversation that involves disagreement and discomfort and one that makes you feel unsafe, unheard, or does not feel constructive. And not everyone is ready to have this conversation, but planting the idea is a great first start. Let's talk about or mention a few don'ts. Don't use loaded terms or accusations, such as, you're a racist, or what a bigot, or there goes your white privilege. While the behavior may indeed fit these descriptions, they're not likely to be productive in a conversation. Don't end the conversation at the first sign of discomfort. Expect for the conversation to be uncomfortable and prepare for disagreement. Don't tell your conversation partner how they should feel. Don't counter with a verbal assault. This can escalate very quickly. Hearing an offense might energize us to verbally blast those we feel are insufficiently aware. And I mentioned Dr. David Camp before. He makes or poses a good question. He asks if such exchanges do anything to reduce the amount of racism or bias skepticism that individuals suffer. And at the end of the day, he suggests that showering righteous indignation may seem more like an emotional indulgence that does not serve the cause of equity. It takes a great deal of discipline to extend dignity to those who are demonstrating adverse views. Don't assume that if a person of color is not present, it's acceptable to allow racial insensitivity. This behavior erodes trust regardless of a person's racial identity. Dr. David Camp is a high-stakes communication leader. In confronting tense racially charged conversations, he outlines a model for us. And in the model, RACE is an acronym. The first part of that is R, reflect. Prepare to be in listening mode. Slow down the urge to strike. And often multiple statements are shared in a string of offenses, and we're just piling them up and getting agitated and excited. But think long range. Use the do's and don'ts that we just discussed. Act. Inquire about the experiences that have led the individual to their revealed assertions, what they're talking about. Connect. Share an anecdote that demonstrates some degree of similarity, and don't discount it by describing it as stupid. It should it should support common perceptions or beliefs that you have with the speaker. And finally, expand. That involves sharing an experience that invites a new awareness. Share what you felt or thought and how that changed your perspective. You don't have to argue or suggest your conversation partner is wrong or flawed, but you may need to gently remind them that you're not asking them to change their belief, but sharing your experience and its impact on you. Rather than using manipulation, this model, the RACE model, keeps a channel open for dialogue with a long-range goal of encouraging your communication partner to consider the impact of a behavior or comment. Finally, let's talk about your obligations as a leader. If leaders want to build deeply inclusive cultures, it requires more than waiting for a harmful incident to speak up or take action. First thing is to set clear expectations regarding inclusion. There is no place for silence. Silence is interpreted as complicity and an absence of psychological safety. And make sure everyone knows where you stand and why. Find the team members, the colleagues, the other leaders who will support you, and ask them to do that in meaningful ways. Expand awareness. What proactive efforts can you implement to help your team members recognize harmful comments or behaviors? There might be short education, TED Talks, articles, group discussions. Those are a few ideas. Including some of these principles in team meetings really keeps it in the forefront. Enforce expectations by establishing and measuring inclusive values and ground rules for team meetings, discussions, and work activities. Consider allotting time at the end of your meetings, or maybe at a midpoint, for the team to reflect and self-assess on how they're doing at modeling these behaviors and where they could make improvements. And implement inclusive technologies. There are a host of technologies available for honoring all points of view. There's a wealth of information available online under the subject meeting facilitation techniques. It gives me an idea. Perhaps we'll address some of these types of tools in a future webinar. Issue challenges. What specific policies, practices, or team behaviors would benefit by having your team examine them with regard to inclusion? What improvements or changes need to be made to your team and the policies and practices that you engage in? When you have to take tough action as a supervisor, consider this. Just because a behavior is legal or a personal liberty doesn't mean it's productive or acceptable for our workplaces. Circumstances and severity may call for involving another party. I mentioned that before, especially where conduct and discipline is involved. Please consult your human resource office if you believe this is the case. While many behaviors and conduct issues are private matters between an employee and a supervisor, many incidents might require the supervisor to restore an environment of trust by publicly denouncing a behavior, not the person, and reinforcing expectations among all who may have witnessed or been subjected to the offense. You know, we don't have to wait to be bias-free to speak up. Frankly, that's not going to happen. We carry biases. We're trying to eliminate our explicit biases, but we will be carrying implicit bias with us. But today, it might be your turn. Tomorrow, you might be the one confronted. We are learners. In an ideal world, we'd like to, we take some of these suggestions and practice and debrief having these conversations in small groups. It's a great idea. And you're welcome to use any of these slides from this presentation or the video itself in your teams. Practice building those skills and reassuring each other that we can make our workplaces safe and inclusive for our colleagues and our customers. Perhaps it goes without saying that the most likely person you will change by learning to effectively confront racial bias is yourself. As Governor Cox acknowledged, it takes work. I hope you find some of the concepts and techniques we shared today, or that I shared today, helpful, and that it will be of some use to you. Before we end, I want to note that coming up in 2 weeks, we'll have Rick Murdoch presenting Cultivating Trust, the Public Sector's as Staple Commodity. And in this, Rick will be discussing a business case for offering and acquiring trust, how to develop trust through high competence and ethical behavior, and the importance of stockpiling trust with management, co-workers, and key stakeholders. Again, that's Wednesday, March 17th, same time, 10 a.m. And as always, you're free to visit our website to view past off-the-shelf webinars, and this webinar will also be found there, and it will also be sent to you along with the PowerPoint slides.